Hello everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to yet another interesting session, and we're going to talk about the governance frameworks in banks today. Now, especially given the context of the RBI Grade B and the Phase 2 exam more specifically, corporate governance has obviously had a huge emphasis over the last several years. And obviously, it's expected as well, right? Given the financial crisis, given the subsequent frauds that have happened in the banking system over the last several years, and also in the NBFC space, a lot of these things had a huge role to play from a corporate governance standpoint. So, while we discussed NBFCs yesterday, the session today focuses on the governance of banks and what are the guidelines that the RBI prescribes the various banks to follow. Now, when I talk about banks, basically the RBI came up with a governance framework in the middle of last year, right? And also gave a clear timeline stating that either 1st of April 2021 or 6 months from the date on which this particular guideline has been clearly communicated on the RBI website, it will basically be applicable as a statute or as a clear guidance framework, right? Having said that, obviously this discussion paper brings in a lot of elements from a governance perspective purely for banks. And which banks are we talking about? We are specifically talking about all your private sector banks, which also includes your small finance banks and your payments banks. It also includes your nationalized banks, it includes your SBI as well, and it includes your regional rural banks. Furthermore, it's also applicable for the wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign banks in India, and also for those foreign banks who are operating in India in the branch mode, right? So it's obviously having a far-ranging applicability overall. So what are we waiting for? Let's get into the nitty-gritties of the session and discuss the latest governance frameworks for banks from an RBI standpoint. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do it as a mix of questions as well as concepts. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So let us kickstart the session with some basic questions. And here's the first one on your screen now. Dash is the duty of each director to decide as well as act on an informed and prudent basis, right? So more from a practical perspective standpoint. And then dash is the duty of each director to act in good faith in the interest of the bank. So there are two fundamental things that are being tested here in the context of a director who is part of a bank's board. So what are the two elements that are getting tested here? And this is very explicitly mentioned in this discussion paper, and it needs to be understood holistically. So first thing is the duty of care, which essentially talks about the fact that the director needs to act on an informed and prudent basis. And second is to act in a good faith in the interest of the bank, in the sense that it's not a personal interest, whereas the interest of the bank and the interest of the shareholders that needs to take precedence over the interest of the individual, right? So from that perspective, the director has a duty of loyalty as well, right? So while I would not have really talked about these things in, let's say, a normal context, but given the scenario in our country right now with so many scandals happening and let's say so many cases of fraud, it becomes extremely important, especially from the context of a bank or a financial system, to ensure that the people that are there at the helm or at the top are definitely doing the ideal job that is required. So as a result, it has now become relevant to define these kind of duties in the context of the board of directors, and especially any kind of director who's employed there, right? And also brings in the focus on something which is again a very important part of the syllabus as far as the RBI exam this year is concerned, which is ethics, right? Now the problem with ethics is that there are definitely a lot of gray areas still there, right? So as a result, it becomes all the more important that you start defining things more clearly, and the more clarity that you bring in, obviously the gray areas can be eliminated, right? So that is the intent with which the discussion paper this time from the RBI basically defines what do they mean by duty of care and what do they mean by duty of loyalty. Moving on to the next question, it basically says that he or she is a member of the board who does not have the responsibilities within the bank. Now all the directors other than the whole-time directors or the WTDs are basically to be considered as dash in terms of part-time, right? So this basically tends to define a very important class of directors within the board of an organization, right? And these are called your NEDs. What do I mean by NEDs? These are basically your non-executive directors, right? So they do not possess any executive function as far as the board is concerned. Neither are they working in the context of the day-to-day functioning of the organization or the bank, but they are associated in a non-executive manner. Now, the question that begs asking is that now that you're talking about your non-executive directors, now who exactly is an executive director then, right? So directors who are basically in the whole time employment of the organization or the bank in the context of this particular discussion paper and are drawing salaries are basically called as your executive directors, right? Now, the next important angle to consider is then what is an independent director? So basically, an independent director has been very clearly defined in the Companies Act 2013 itself. But if you have to understand one thing, your independent director will by default become a non-executive director, but a non-executive director always may not be an independent director, right? That's the fundamental difference, right? And similarly, when you talk about a non-executive director, he could be a dependent or an independent director both. That's the context. And especially when we're talking about in the context of your independent director, a director who does not have any material monetary relationship with the company except his or her approved remuneration. That is what is an independent director, completely working independently as far as the board is concerned and not directly related with the organization and not having any conflicts of interest. Such kind of person is generally considered as your independent director. Right, so let's move on further and look at the next question. So it says DASH is the overall approach which basically includes your policies, processes, controls and systems through which the risk appetite is established. Risk appetite means what? Appetite refers to what? Hunger, right? And when I say risk appetite, what is the hunger for that particular bank to take on risk? What is the accepted level of risk that the bank is willing to take? Right, and that needs to be effectively established, communicated, and at the same time it also needs to be monitored so that you're not breaching any kind of limits on this front, right? So it obviously includes a risk appetite statement. You're talking about limits that are there on the risks, right? It also has an outline in terms of the roles and responsibilities of those who are overseeing the implementations and the monitoring of this particular entity, right? Now what we're trying to find out is what is this one? While it is being defined quite extensively, we need to understand what exactly one is, right? Then we're saying that one shall also consider the risks that are there to the bank as well as to its reputation vis-a-vis the depositors, the investors and customers, right? So all these guys, while they may not directly be the shareholders of the company or in the case of a bank, but they definitely form an integral part of what is known as your stakeholders, right? So your depositors, investors and your customers obviously are your stakeholders to a bank as well, right? And then the one must be in alignment with the bank's overall strategy. So what we need to find out is what exactly is this one, which is talking about your policies, processes, controls and systems. So essentially this basically talks about what is known as your RAF, and we'll discuss RAF in a brief bit. But in the interim, let's try and look at the second half of the question as well. So it says, on the other hand, DASH, which basically refers to 2, is a written articulation of the aggregate level and the types of risk that a bank will accept or even avoid, right? And what's the end outcome that the bank is willing to or looking to achieve? It is basically looking to achieve all its business objectives or the targets that it has set for itself. And these could be part of the vision and mission statements of the bank and a lot of such things. So what is the aggregate level and the types of risk that a bank will accept or will avoid? That is what 2 talks about. So it basically includes your quantitative risk measures, and these are expressed relative to the earnings, the capital, liquidity, and let's say other relevant measures as may be appropriate. And it should also include qualitative statements to basically address things like reputation, conduct or misconduct risks, and let's say risks from unethical practices as well as money laundering. So all of these essentially get covered in 2. So both of them are pretty similar in the context that they're trying to address the risks, right? And also define them holistically, and also looking at kind of managing and monitoring the risk elements overall, right? And if a bank has these 2 in place, automatically the stakeholders can understand the level of risk that the bank is willing to take in a much better manner. So what are these 2? So the first one that we're looking at is basically your RAF or your risk appetite framework. It's called a framework because it is talking about your policies, processes, controls and systems through which the risk appetite is not just being established and communicated, but also monitored. That's the first angle as far as RAF is concerned. The second aspect which we're talking about is your risk appetite statement, which kind of covers from a stakeholder standpoint as well as to what are the risks and the aggregate level that the bank will accept or avoid in order to achieve its business objectives, right? So these two are pretty much very important for any bank to have, if not already existing, right? That's the context with which RAF and RAS become very important from the banking corporate governance standpoint. Moving on to the next question. You're basically talking about culture, also including elements of risk, which is your risk culture as well. What do I mean by a risk culture? It essentially means that throughout the organization, and especially in the context of a bank, the organization or the bank needs to understand risk at every level, right? And every individual employee of the bank needs to have this risk culture ingrained in them so as to avoid any kind of mishaps that can happen because of various factors and reasons, right? Now, as per the guidance on the supervisory interaction with financial institutions on risk culture, a framework for assessing the risk culture that was basically brought out in April 2014, the indicators for assessing risk culture can be basically grouped under 4 broad criteria. Right. Now the question is, which of the following is not one of those criteria? Right. That's the question. Right. So let's look at the first one. It says tone from the bottom. So when I say bottom here, I think it's referring to the employees or let's say the union and going up from there. Second, it talks about accountability. Third, it talks about effective communication and challenge. And fourth, it talks about the audit structure. Right. Now when I say inculcation of a risk culture, right, and a framework for that, what is important is not what the bottom is thinking. What is important is the tone that is there at the top management. What does the board think? What does the senior management have to say, right? How are they effectively communicating and passing on that risk culture from the top to every single employee at the lowest strata of the organization? So that becomes important. Secondly, accountability, definitely very, very important, because every single individual has to be accountable for the decisions that they are taking, which may put the bank at risk in case any wrong decisions are taken. So there has to be complete accountability as well. And the next element that you're looking at is effective communication and challenge. So when you say challenge, here is where, let's say, the bottom comes into the picture, the employees, the staff, right? And you talk about, let's say, the independence of your independent directors. While they're technically independent directors in the name, but are they living up to their name? Are they independent genuinely? Those things become important. Are you having the ability as an employee to basically challenge any wrongdoing in the organization? All of those things become very important. So that is something which is the third criteria. And the fourth one does not necessarily talk about audit, basically talks about a very, very important element. And if that ends up being misaligned, then it can lead to a lot of chaos in the entire system. And this is basically your incentive structure. And it was these misaligned incentives that has been the reason for a lot of financial crises that have happened in the past. And it's important that these incentives in terms of structure are properly aligned so that your members, especially on the context of the senior management, right, who are also in any kind of a risk-taking position, do not end up doing things which may be good for their own personal growth but not necessarily good for the bank, right? And that is where your incentives need to be aligned properly so that your incentive structure does not basically motivate greater amount of risk taking at the expense of the bank's performance, right? And when I say bank's performance, I'm not just saying the bank's performance immediately, but in the long run, in terms of, let's say, reputational elements, brand, risk, and a lot of such factors, right? So that becomes very, very crucial as far as this fourth element is concerned, which is your incentive structure. So essentially, which are the 4 broad criteria that are basically indicators in terms of assessing your risk culture? You are looking at essentially the tone from the top, accountability, effective communication and challenge, and the fourth one is your incentive structure. So which are the ones which are wrong? It's option E. So both A and D are incorrect as far as this particular question is concerned. And what are the actual elements that need to be considered? It's basically tone from the top, or you can say tone that is there from or at the top, accountability, effective communication and challenge, and the fourth one is basically your incentive structure. That obviously matters quite a bit. Right. So moving on to the next question, and it basically says that as part of the from the top or at the top guideline, you're talking about an offline process by which every employee in the bank spends at least 30 minutes every month reviewing a conduct training, as in a manual, before signing the code of conduct statement, right? So the question here is the above statement true or false? If you look at the statement overall, my biggest problem here is that are you wanting your employees to basically spend 30 minutes on this activity every month? May not be the right thing to do. Obviously, it's important for your employees to understand the code of conduct statement and what exactly are their duties, how they exactly should perform those duties. All those things are important. Having a conduct training manual is also important, but this should probably be looked at as an annual exercise. You may probably increase the time duration of this to, let's say, a higher level, but ideally it cannot be a monthly exercise. It definitely should be looked at from an annual perspective. So in that sense, this statement is basically false. So what is the correct statement that we're looking for? It's basically an online process by which every employee in the bank spends at least 60 minutes every year reviewing a conduct training manual before signing the code of conduct. So this is what is the actual guideline that has been proposed by the RBI. Now, another important aspect is confirming that the employees, including your senior management, are basically aware that appropriate disciplinary or other actions, right? And the other actions could also include those relating to, let's say, compensation or even things like career progression, will follow unacceptable behaviors, including weak management oversight and transgressions, including willful blindness, right? So the employees need to understand, and not just the employees, but everyone, including the senior management, should be aware that there is a chance that appropriate disciplinary or other actions can be taken if they go in a manner which is unacceptable, right? Now, these actions could relate to things like your compensation and career progression as well, and also to the extent that it can be looked at from a dismissal standpoint as well, right? So that is the thought process that needs to be understood, that in case there are any wrongdoings, then obviously you will definitely be held responsible, and it can also impact your career progression and compensation within the bank as well. So this is something which is very important for the employees, especially the senior management and the other categories, what are known as your MRTs, which is your material risk takers. So these guys especially should understand this aspect as well, right? So while you may be rewarded for your performance and, let's say, things that can actually help the bank go further, at the same time, you will also be reprimanded and have negative consequences to your compensation and career progression in case of any unacceptable behavior and transgressions, which also include willful blindness, right? That's the context. Moving further, we're basically talking about another important question, which says the ultimate responsibility for ensuring accountability for the misconduct basically has to lie with the board, of course, right? Because they are the leaders of the organization of the bank. So obviously, the majority of your responsibility or the ultimate responsibility and ownership will definitely lie with the board. Now, the board shall also oversee the compensation system that basically promotes prudent risk-taking behavior, right? Prudent in the sense that the risk-taking has to be definitely practical in the context that it has to look at what is happening as far as competition is concerned, but everything has to happen within the purview of the regulatory guidelines that have been laid down in the country, right? So that's why it's called prudent risk-taking. Risk-taking is allowed, but it has to be practical. It has to be in sync with the regulations, right? And then you're talking about your business practices and basically look to identify tools which mitigate or address misconduct. So what are those compensation systems and methodologies or techniques that can basically promote prudent risk-taking behavior, business practices, and also help in mitigate or address any kind of misconduct that is happening, right? So from that perspective, what are the compensation practices that are there? So first thing, in-year adjustments, wherein you talk about, let's say there is a compensation that has been provided, you need to ensure that there could be adjustments that are made from a mid-year perspective itself, and then you look at the variable pay components as well, right? And there are multiple standards that have basically been brought in from a variable pay perspective also. So this came out basically as a guideline which was given out by RBI in November 2019, and it basically talks about the guideline on your compensation in terms of your whole-time directors, in terms of your chief executive officers, in terms of your material risk takers. So this was something which was definitely done, and especially in the context of your CEOs, whole-time directors, and your material risk takers, it has been very clearly defined as to what are the restrictions in terms of your variable pay that could be applicable to such directors. This basically also includes things like your in-year adjustment, and it also talks about things like what should be the balance between your fixed pay versus your variable pay, and it kind of highlights that at least 50% should actually be variable, and it should be paid on the basis of the individual business unit or the firm-wide measures that basically looks at performance, right? All of those things will be considered. So at least 50% has to be variable. And the other aspect is that your total variable pay has to be limited to a maximum of basically 300% of the fixed pay. And obviously this is for the relative performance measurement period that is being discussed. Now, in case your variable pay is, let's say, up to 200% of the fixed pay, then a minimum of 50% of such variable pay has to be in the form of your non-cash instruments. Right now, in case the variable pay is greater than 200%, then a minimum of 67% of such variable pay has to be in the form of non-cash instruments. Right, that's very, very important. The other important angle to consider is that in case of a deteriorating performance by the bank, right, it should automatically lead to a contraction in the variable pay as well, wherein, let's say, if the bank is not performing that great, there is a chance that the variable pay for such director can actually fall to zero as well, right? The next important angle to be considered is your deferred variable pay, wherein you're saying that it's not necessary for me to pay out the entire variable pay as soon as it is due, right? So technically you can basically hold some portion of the variable pay and basically pay it out over a period of time or pay it out at the end of the period. So that is something that can also happen, especially when you're talking about your senior executives, including your whole-time directors and other employees who are your material risk takers. You're basically looking at a minimum of 60% of the total variable pay must be under deferral arrangements, which means it will not be paid automatically. Secondly, if you're talking about the cash component also as a part of the variable pay, then at least 50% of such cash bonus should also be deferred, right? Now, obviously there's a cap here as well, that in case the variable pay in terms of cash component is, let's say, under rupees 25 lakh, in that case, obviously this 50% clause will not be applicable, right? Now, the other aspect in terms of deferral is that this deferral period has to be basically a period of minimum 3 years. That's very, very important, right? And this will be applicable to both your cash as well as your non-cash components of the variable pay. Now, what is the thought process behind deferring this, right? The thought process behind deferring this is that in case there is some contraction in the performance of the bank, or let's say some regulatory lapses get identified, then basically it allows you to ensure that whatever amount has not been paid, you can stall such amount to be paid. And you can also look at things like a clawback arrangement, wherein whatever money has already been paid can actually be pulled back, right? And if there was some kind of an act which was in the negative context, then automatically such an executive will be kind of held responsible for that as well, right? Now, what exactly do I mean by malus, right? So when I say malus, it essentially permits the company to reduce the value of all, or let's say part of your deferred remuneration, right? And let's say, for example, when you're talking about subsequent performance targets are not getting reached and maybe there is risk management failure also, in that case, the organization can reduce the value of the deferred payments that need to be paid to such executives, right? That is the whole context of malus. Now, in a way, I can consider the malus as an opposite to a bonus. So bonus is basically what you get for a great performance. Malus is basically what is taken away from you in case it is a negative or a bad performance, right? So it's basically the downward adjustment, right? It's a downward adjustment, niche ki taraf, downward adjustment of your incentive, right? And that is before they become payable, right? On the other hand, when I'm talking about a clawback arrangement, it is basically a contractual provision whereby money already paid to an employee must be returned to an employer or a benefactor, right? And sometimes this may happen with a penalty, right? So again, an example of this was basically a lot of senior executives in certain leading entities in the financial space as far as India is concerned were basically asked to pay back quite a bit of portion in terms of their bonuses. So obviously these were senior management officials from a leading stock exchange in the country. While I'd not want to name them specifically, but the point is there was a clawback that happened in such scenarios as well. So that is something which needs to be understood, that the compensation system obviously has a fair component of fixed as well as variable pays, and how the variable pay needs to be paid out, what are its components, what is the maximum limit allowed for it, all of those things have also been very clearly defined in the guideline that has been laid out by the RBI in November 2019. Right? And obviously, when you're talking about what kind of compensation system measures can be adopted, you're looking at in-year adjustments, you're talking about malus, and you're talking about clawback arrangements. Now, another important element is a widely publicized whistleblower policy is also needed, wherein, let's say, anyone in the organization can basically highlight a challenge, or let's say bring out some irregularities in terms of the performance of the bank, or let's say some flouting of regulations that is happening at the bank, and that needs to definitely be allowed. And any whistleblower policy has to protect the interests of the whistleblower, provided the whistleblower is following all the necessary channels in the correct manner. Right? So no protection will be available to the whistleblower in case he or she directly goes to the media. Right? So that also something is to be understood. So whistleblower policies, again, a very important aspect which the RBI has basically asked all banks to kind of have. Right. So moving further, basically talking about another important aspect which basically says that the board shall have formal written conflicts of interest policy and an objective compliance process to basically ensure implementation of this particular policy as well. Now, the policy shall, amongst other things, not include which of the following? That's the question. So first, a rigorous review and approval process for the directors to follow before they engage in certain activities such as serving on another board. Right? So all of these things have to be properly approved, and there is a rigorous review process that needs to be in place. This sounds to be quite logical. Looking at second, a director's duty to promptly disclose any matter that may result or has already resulted in a conflict of interest. So one of the things that you need to understand from a director's standpoint is whenever in doubt, disclose. Simple. Right? So whenever you're in doubt that you're basically doing something which can actually lead to material conflict of interest, or let's say might be in contravention to the guidelines of the RBI, then it's best to disclose anything and everything that is there, right? That's the best strategy for a director. So this also appears to be correct. Looking at the third one, it says a director's responsibility to vote or influence in any manner on any matter where the director may have a conflict of interest, or where the director's objectivity or ability to properly fulfill duties to the bank may be compromised. Now, it is the director's responsibility in such a scenario not to vote or influence in any manner where there is a conflict of interest. So if there is a conflict of interest, the director should obviously stay away from such a situation. So obviously this one is definitely wrong. Moving on, it says adequate procedures for transactions with related parties, so that if at all, it must be undertaken. When I say it refers to such related party transactions, RPTs. If such transactions have to be undertaken, it shall be possible to clearly demonstrate without any reasonable doubt that it was made on arm's length basis, which means that there was no special treatment given to such related party, right? It was treated at par with any other third party that could be there, and that is what is basically known as your arm's length treatment, right? Or the answer is basically none of these. So in this case, we're clear that obviously the policy shall not include this one, because a director's responsibility is not to vote or influence in case there is a conflict of interest, and that's what is getting addressed in this particular contract. Right. Moving on to the next element. Basically, it says that as part of the overall governance framework, the board is responsible for overseeing a strong risk governance framework. Obviously, a risk governance framework shall include well-defined organizational responsibilities for risk management, which basically refers to as what, right? Now, this has been defined, and you should understand that a lot of the points that have been included in this particular document that the RBI has prepared has taken or drawn heavily from, let's say, the Bank Board's Bureau, or let's say the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, and a lot of such related documents. So these are obviously measures that have been adopted globally as well, and the RBI is taking cue from such measures, right? So this basically talks about the line of defense, right? And the first is basically the first line of defense, which is the business line. These are the guys on the ground, the foot soldiers, so to speak, who are executing the transactions, who are meeting clients, and who are bringing in the business, right? So that's your first line of defense, right? So the first line of defense obviously needs to have a very strong culture of adhering to the limits that have been set. Now, there are limits from a single borrower perspective and also a group entity perspective, right? All those limits need to be adhered to. Then also the RBI has come up with something called as the large exposures framework. So your guidelines pertaining to that also need to be adhered to, right? So all your risk exposures need to be effectively managed, and the business line, which is bringing the business, is also the first line of defense, and they have to be held accountable for such limits getting breached, right? And apart from the business line, you also need a robust finance function within the bank, which will be operating independent of the business line and have a reporting structure which is different from the business line, so that they can act independently and basically provide inputs in terms of what is happening as far as the finance of the bank is concerned, and what is happening in terms of the limits and the risk exposures being effectively managed, right? So that's the first line of defense, which is your business line. The second line of defense basically has two components. One, a risk management function, which basically is looking at overseeing the bank's risk-taking activities, assessing the kind of risk that the bank is taking, and also identify issues, anything that are there in the context of the risk from the bank's standpoint, right? And all of these need to be done independently. The second is basically a compliance function, which will basically routinely monitor all the compliance aspects with respect to all applicable statutes and governance angles that may be there in terms of rules, regulations, codes, and policies, to basically manage what is your compliance risk. Now, the big question that comes in is, now, what is this compliance risk? So when I talk about compliance risk, what exactly does it entail, right? So it is basically the risk of any kind of legal or say regulatory sanctions, right? Or let's say any kind of a material financial loss, or let's say a loss of reputation that a bank may suffer because of its failure to comply, right, with regards to any kind of regulations or laws or rules, right? Basically related to also things like something which is to be self-regulatory standpoint, also known as your self-regulatory organization standards, right? And codes of conducts that are applicable to its specific kind of activity. So in case there is any kind of legal or regulatory sanction on the bank, material financial loss or loss of reputation, all of that basically falls under compliance risk, right? Now, both of these elements are basically your second line of defense, which is your risk management function and the compliance function, and put together, both your A and B need to act independently of one, which is your business line, right? And they should obviously have sufficient authority, stature, independence, resources, and most importantly, access to the board. So this is your second line of defense. Now, the third element is basically an internal audit and vigilance function, which again operates independently from both 1 and 2, right? So that is again the third angle. And obviously that is something which is going to be again very crucial, because an independent internal audit system will also bring in relevant third parties whenever required, and also have a clear vigilance function whose job will be to completely monitor what is happening inside the bank, right? So that is the most important aspect, and these are the three lines of defense from the perspective of a overall governance framework, right? So if I talk about a strong risk governance framework, what are the elements included in this? We're talking about it as the three lines of defense. The first line, which is your business line, the second line, which is your risk management and compliance functions, and the third line, which is basically talking about your internal audit and your vigilance functions. Right. So moving further, what I wanted to discuss next was another interesting question. It says, to support its own performance, the board shall carry out regular assessments alone or with the assistance of your external experts, right? Now, what kind of assessments are to be carried? Assessments of the board, its committees, its individual board members, and the board shall periodically review its structure, size, composition, as well as the committee's structures and coordination, and also assess the ongoing suitability of each board member periodically, right? And now the question is, how frequently are we to test whether your individual performance of the board members is effectively scrutinized, and also considering his or her performance on the board to ensure that they are fit and proper, which means the guidelines that have been laid down in terms of fit and proper criteria, do the board members actually fulfill such criteria as well? And this action is something that needs to be done on an annual basis, right? So that is what is the answer to this particular question. At least annually, all of these things need to be cross-checked, right? So moving further to the next question, it basically says, which of the following committees are considered as minimum for executing the supervisory role of the board, right? So there are multiple committees that can obviously be there in existence, but obviously you're looking at things like your audit committee, your risk management committee, your nomination and remuneration committee. And the next question is, are all of these three the only ones, or only A and B? So technically, you need to have a committee for nomination and remuneration as well, one for risk management and one for audit. So all these three become the bare minimum in terms of supervisory role of the board. Obviously, there are multiple other committees that could also be formed by the board, right? So for example, you talk about the executive committee or your management committee, also known in many organizations as your MANCO. Then you also have things like your asset liability committee that could also be formed within the context of the board, and multiple such committees can definitely be there, but these three are considered to be the primary or the preliminary ones that should ideally be there, right? So the answer in this case is all of the above, that is all A, B and C, right? And we'll discuss about each of these committees in detail in the coming slides. Now, first thing, we talk about what is your audit committee of the board. This is the first committee that we're looking at. First thing, it's made up only of your non-executive directors. Second, it's made up of at least 3 non-executive directors, and 2/3 of these non-executive directors need to be independent directors. So assuming that only 3 non-executive directors are there, then essentially you should have at least 2 independent directors, right? So obviously saying made up of at least 3, so obviously it can be higher than that as well, but it has to be made up of only your non-executive directors who are not involved in the day-to-day execution of tasks at the bank. Next thing, they shall meet with a quorum. When I say quorum, what is the minimum number of members required? So the quorum required is 3 members, out of which 2/3 will be your independent directors, right? So they shall definitely meet. Next thing, all the members of the audit committee obviously have to be financially literate. They obviously will have to have the ability to understand a balance sheet, an income statement, a cash flow statement, as well as the notes attached thereto as well. So that is the first requirement as far as your membership criteria is concerned. All of them have to be financially literate, and at least one member will have specialized knowledge in terms of accounting or related financial management expertise, right? So that has to be there definitely. Next thing, all your audit committee meetings will be chaired by an independent director, right? And the important thing is that this independent director shall not chair any other committee meeting or any other committee of the board, right? So that's very, very important. So an independent director will chair the ACB, and that independent director cannot chair any other committee of the board. Next thing, the chair of the bank shall not be a member of the committee. So the chairman of the bank will not be a member of the audit committee. Next thing, the committee chair shall be present at the annual general meeting to answer any kind of shareholder queries that are there, right? Now, this point is especially relevant in the context of ensuring complete independence of the audit committee and no interference from any other party from within the bank. So that is where it's important that the chairman also of the bank shall not be a member of the committee. Next thing, you're basically looking at the committee to meet at least 6 times a year, and not more than 60 days shall elapse between 2 meetings, right? So you have to meet within 60 days and you have to meet at least 6 times in a year. Next, your head of internal audit, that's a special post that has been created, shall basically act as the secretary to this particular committee and will also report to the audit committee of the board, that is ACB. Next thing, the audit committee also needs to put in place an effective fraud risk assessment as well as management systems, which basically involves monitoring and reviewing all frauds of rupees 1 crore and above. So when you say monitoring and reviewing, it means first of all avoid such occurrences from happening. But in case something like this happens, what are the mitigation methodologies? What was the challenges? Why this fraud happened, right? What could have been done to avoid it? Why did it take so much time to identify that fraud? All of these things need to be obviously looked at very meticulously. The next thing is basically the implementation of a credible whistleblower mechanism, which is basically going to be reviewed at least annually, so as to ensure that this actually is functioning and working, right? Next thing, your overall financial risk governance framework and your internal control systems need to be also reviewed. Now, this review can be done independently or can be done internally as well. And it needs to happen at least once in 3 years, right? Your financial risk governance framework and your internal control systems, right? So obviously these are some of the critical elements of the audit committee of the board, right? Now moving to the next aspect, which is your RMCB or your risk management committee of the board. Again, has a huge role to play overall, right? Again, just like your ACBs, made up only of non-executive directors. Again, the same context, made up of at least 3 non-executive directors, and 2/3 of them have to be independent directors. Again, for a meeting, the quorum has to be minimum 3 members, out of which 2/3 have to be independent directors. Next, they have at least 1 member which has risk management expertise. Unlike the ACB, where it was an accounting or a financial management expertise needed, here you need to have at least 1 member with a risk management expertise, and there is no specifically requirement of financially literate persons, right? So that was something that was there in ACB. It's not so much over here. Next, your RMCB meetings will again be chaired by an independent director who will not chair any other committee of the board, again to ensure independence. Next, the chairman of the bank shall not be member of the committee. So again, pretty much similar in terms of the guidelines that have been laid down for your audit committee as well. Next, your committee chair shall obviously be present at the AGM to answer any kind of shareholder queries. And then the committee again has to meet at least 6 times a year, and at least, let's say, twice within a span of 60 days. That's the context, right? Next, your chief risk officer shall obviously act as secretary to the committee. Now, another important element which we discussed was compliance. So both your chief risk officer and your chief compliance officer will basically report into this particular committee. Next, obviously you need to set up the risk appetite for the bank based on the capacity of risk that the bank can take, and all of these have to be formulated in the context of your risk appetite framework and your risk appetite statement. So all of that obviously have to be taken into account. Next thing, there has to be a clear segregation between risk origination. Where is the risk coming from? It is coming from the front office. Underwriting of that particular risk, which basically gets done at the mid office level, and then risk documentation and the operations functions, which basically happens at the back office, and also the governing lines of hierarchy for all of these 3 elements, which is your front office, your mid office, and your back office. All of these 3 need to be very clearly segregated in terms of the reporting lines, so that there is no conflict of interest happening at all, and all these 3 functions can actually work independently. That's very, very crucial. Next element, you need to have technology enabled systems to basically track adherence to all the covenants that have been put in place in terms of measures that have to be adopted, or let's say risk limits that need to be put in place, and also such kind of things. Next, your risk monitoring and reporting needs to happen at 2 levels. One, at a disaggregated level, which basically looks at, let's say, the material risk that is residing in your subsidiaries or other group entities as well, right, on which there could be some kind of an exposure. So that is a disaggregated level. And then it also needs to have a view in terms of an aggregated level of risk, right, so that you can have an integrated perspective of the various kinds of risk exposures that are there. And basically this kind of an integrated view will convey to, let's say, the committee as to what is the bank-wide risk that is there, right? What are the individual portfolio risks besides other kinds of risks, right? So you need to have a risk monitoring and reporting that needs to happen at a disaggregated as well as an aggregated level, right? So these are some of the responsibilities and critical functions from a risk management committee or RMCB. Moving further, we look at the third important committee, which is basically your NRC or your nomination and remuneration committee. Now again, it has to be made up only of non-executive directors with at least 3 non-executive directors. And in this case, the difference is not 2/3, it's 1/2 independent directors. and with one member of the risk management committee of the board as well, right? That's the fundamental difference between ACB, RMCB and this NRC committee. Second, obviously they shall meet with a quorum of 3 members, of which at least half have to be independent directors. Next, your NRC meetings will be chaired by an independent director. It does not specifically mention that this particular independent director cannot be a chair of any other committee. So it's not explicitly mentioned, but ideally this is something which is up to the bank to decide whether this ID can be a chair of any other committee or not. But it's not specifically asked for that this ID should not be a chair of any other committee, unlike what was mentioned in RMCB and ACB. Next, the chair of the bank again shall not chair this particular committee, but it does not say that the chair of the bank cannot be a member of this committee, which means that technically the chairman can be allowed to be a member, but obviously he or she cannot chair the committee itself. Next thing, again, the committee has to meet 6 times a year and not more than 60 days shall elapse between 2 consecutive meetings. Next, the head of human resources or the CHRO or the chief human resource officer shall basically act as the secretary to this particular committee. Next thing, this committee needs to ensure that the structure, size and competencies and skills that are required at the board are obviously present in all the board members that have been appointed, and also in terms of the committees that basically support the strategic objectives as well as the requirements from a statutory and regulatory standpoint as well, right? So while the board members and the senior management officials should obviously have competencies and the skills that are required, but they should also be fulfilling all the fit and proper criteria that could be there from a statutory and a regulatory standpoint. And this committee needs to ensure the structure and the size of the board as well, and all of its committees. Next thing, once every year, based on some kind of a gap assessment that happens, this committee needs to undertake a formal program for the board of directors in terms of ensuring that they learn the critical elements of the business, the new compliance elements that have been brought in, the new regulations, new guidelines, whatever are there. The board of directors needs to be apprised of such scenarios. Next thing, through a diversity policy, this committee obviously needs to ensure that the committees of the board that are there are not dominated by any one individual or any particular group of individuals, and all those committees also meet the statutory requirements, right? So there has to be a very clear diversity policy also in place. Next thing, you need to obviously formulate and adopt a comprehensive compensation policy that needs to be there in terms of the board of directors and the management functionaries, and a lot of these elements have to be in line with the RBI guidelines that have been laid out in the directions that were given out in November 2019, right? Next thing, obviously you need to have a criteria and policy formulation for a lot of these elements. So the first thing is the policy formulation around fit and proper directors, and how do you ensure that ongoing these directors are tested. When I say tested, obviously once in a year there needs to be a deed, also basically known as your deed of covenant, and this is something that needs to be signed by every director and the CEO or any other person authorized by the board, and this is something that every new director has to sign, right? So obviously contents will basically talk about the guidelines and the directions that are there in terms of what the RBI is saying, and all of these things will definitely be part of this particular deed. And every year, as on 31st March, a declaration has to be signed by every single director, right? And any changes in whatever their fit and proper criteria is supposed to be, and if there is any changes in what the director has done or is in the process of doing in the last 1 year, which does not make them fit or proper, or has a potential of conflicting the fit and proper criteria, those things have obviously got to be disclosed. And in case everything is fit and proper, then on 31st March every year, the declaration to that effect that nothing has changed has to be signed by every single director, right? So that is where we're talking about policy formulation from a fit and proper criteria for your directors. Obviously, your remuneration needs to be linked with performance benchmarks, right? And that is definitely a key element, and including performance benchmarks from the context of your variable pay, and also things like malus and clawback arrangements that we discussed earlier. So all that also is important. Then you have to look at the performance effectiveness of the personnel as well. So we're talking about independent directors, non-executive directors. Are they also fulfilling their responsibilities and duties? So the policy formulation has to be on that effect as well. Then you obviously need to have very clear succession planning. in terms of the next resource that could be required and how are you going to hire them, right? And you also need to look at the extension and also the termination of your whole-time directors, independent directors, non-executive directors. All that also needs to be put in place. And of course, you need to have a very clear learning and development policy, which has to be obviously for everyone in the organization, but more so in the context of your senior management and your directors, so that they're completely aware of the changing regulations and the landscape from that perspective. So these are some of the critical responsibilities of the NRC and also some of the elements in terms of the composition of this committee. Moving on to another important element of composition, which is basically the composition of the board itself. So what does the board of a bank look like, especially in the context of what the RBI is saying? So the RBI says not less than 6 directors and not more than 15 directors, right? With a majority being your independent directors. Next thing, the board has to meet at least 6 times a year and at least once every 60 days. Next thing, all meetings of the board should have a majority of the independent directors present. Next, the board cannot meet unless you have a quorum of 5 members at least. Then, you shall not have more than 3 directors on the board who are directors of companies which among themselves are basically entitled to exercise more than 20% of the total voting rights of all the shareholders of the bank, right? So if you have more than 3 such directors, right, such that the voting rights crosses 20%, then that is not allowed. You need to have a lesser number as compared to that. Next, at least half the members of the board shall consist of persons who have special knowledge or practical experience in one or more. Now, what are these one or more? It could be accountancy, it could be agriculture and rural economy, it could be banking, it could be cooperation, it could be economics, finance, law, small scale industries, IT, payments and settlement systems, human resources, risk management, business management, or any other matter in the opinion of the RBI which they feel can be useful to the banking company, right? Now, the second aspect is, apart from this, at least one director shall basically represent your agriculture and or rural economy, and one shall basically represent your cooperation and or small scale industry, right? Now, technically, this provision does not apply to the context of any company which has been granted a license under the payments bank business, right? So while half the members of the board shall consist of persons who have special knowledge, but this individual clause wherein one director for agriculture and rural economy and one director for cooperation and or small scale industry, that does not specifically apply to your payments banks, right? Next thing, what is the role of the chairman? The chair obviously shall be an independent director and shall also be present at the annual general meeting. Next thing, the appointment of the chairman of any banking company shall be with the previous approval of the Reserve Bank of India, and obviously will be subject to such conditions as RBI may specify while giving such kind of an approval, right? So what I've done in this session is to obviously give you an overview of the critical elements that have been discussed in this paper, and all of these technically are going to be live by 1st April 2021. That's the expectation, right? And obviously, if there are any changes to this overall, then definitely the RBI will also go ahead and inform such changes as well. So the banks are obviously expected to adhere to these requirements, and having said this, this new framework will definitely bring in a greater sense of corporate governance, ownership and accountability in the banking space in our country. Right, so I hope you enjoyed today's session. It kind of covered the governance frameworks in banks, looked at some of the key committees that are there. It also looked at the composition of the board from a bank's perspective. We also discussed remuneration, especially the concepts of variable pay and what percentage of the fixed pay should it be. A lot of such discussions happened and a lot of relevant points covered, right? So we talked about the 3 line of defenses, the first line, the second line and the third line. We talked about the audit committee, the risk management committee, and also the nomination and remuneration committee, and various other elements as well, right? So I've obviously tried to cover as much as possible from this discussion paper. Having said that, if you want more information, you can definitely look at the actual discussion paper itself. And obviously, you're free to post on the comment section in this particular video, and we'll be happy to address any queries or questions that you may have, right? So with that, I take your leave for this particular session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Until then, have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. See you guys.